The night I found out, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just that quiet, persistent Berlin drizzle that soaks through everything without announcing itself. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, staring at my wife's phone screen lighting up in the dark. She'd left it face up on the counter when she went to shower. A mistake she'd never made before in 8 months. The name on the screen was Daniel. Not a contact name. Not a saved number. Just, Daniel. And the preview of the message read, "Tonight was everything." I didn't touch the phone. I just sat there, watching the screen fade back to black, and felt something inside my chest do the same. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 years old. I'm a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Schoenberg, the kind of job that sounds impressive at dinner parties but mostly means I spend my days staring at load-bearing calculations and arguing with contractors over the phone. I've worked at Kellner and Braun for 6 years. I make a decent salary. I come home on time. I remember birthdays. I married Claire when I was 29. She was 27, working as a graphic designer for a boutique agency, with paint-stained fingers and a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. We met at a friend's gallery opening, argued about a painting neither of us actually liked, and went for wine afterward. 3 years later, we were married in a small ceremony outside Hamburg, with 12 guests and a cake she designed herself. That was 12 years ago. We have a daughter, Lena, 9 years old, who is currently sleeping upstairs with her stuffed elephant pressed against her face and absolutely no idea that the world her parents built for her is quietly coming apart at the seams. For 11 of those 12 years, I would have told you our marriage was solid. Not perfect. Solid. We argued about money, about screen time, about whose turn it was to call the plumber. Claire was stubborn, I was emotionally avoidant, or so she told me during our one and only round of couples therapy 3 years ago. We went 4 times. Things improved, or we stopped noticing they hadn't. The 12th year started quietly enough. It was January. Cold. Claire had just landed a significant new client, I remember because she came home flushed with excitement, opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving, and said, "Things are going to change this year." I thought she meant professionally. I raised my glass. I smiled. I had no idea what was already in motion. The client's name was Daniel Farrow. He was the creative director of a mid-level marketing firm that had contracted Claire's agency for a full brand redesign. She mentioned him in passing the first time, the client's a bit demanding but interesting, and I filed it away under the category of work conversations I was expected to acknowledge but not remember. I should have remembered. But there's something else I haven't told you yet. Something that makes this story not just about a wife who lied, but about a layer of betrayal I never saw coming, one that came from a direction I trusted even more. Because Daniel Farrow wasn't just Claire's client. He was my boss's son. And my boss, Henrik Kellner, senior partner, the man I'd worked under for 6 years, the man who'd signed off on my last 2 promotions, the man who'd shaken my hand at our Christmas party 2 weeks before all of this began, Henrik knew. I just didn't know that he knew. Not yet. That night, with the rain against the window and the coffee going cold and Claire's phone dark on the counter, I sat very still and thought about the last 8 months. The late evenings. The rescheduled dinners. The way Claire had started tilting her phone screen down whenever I walked into the room. The new perfume she'd bought in March and said was a gift from a colleague. The weekend in April when she'd taken Lena to her mother's and I'd been left in our apartment with a creeping sense that the rooms were slightly different, not rearranged, just inhabited by someone I'd begun not to recognize. I thought about all of it. And then Claire came out of the bathroom in her robe, towel around her hair, and smiled at me the way she always did, easy, practiced, warm. "You look tired," she said. "Long day," I said. She picked up her phone from the counter without looking at it and took it upstairs with her. I stayed at the kitchen table for another hour. I didn't sleep much that night. And in the morning, everything looked exactly the same as it always had, which was, I was beginning to understand, the most dangerous sign of all. Marcus's opening portrait of his marriage is built on the language of sufficiency, solid, decent, on time. These are not the words of a man in love, they are the words of a man who has quietly negotiated love down to a manageable standard. Psychologically, this reveals a pattern common in long-term partnerships where emotional intimacy has been replaced by functional stability. Marcus doesn't describe passion or longing, he describes reliability and competence. His identity is tied to being dependable, to remembering birthdays, coming home, doing his part. This is both his strength and his blind spot. The moment he sees "Tonight Was Everything" on Claire's phone, his reaction is telling. He doesn't move, doesn't confront, doesn't rage. He watches the screen fade and feels something in his chest do the same. This emotional mirroring, the extinguishing of feeling to match an extinguishing screen, suggests a man who has learned to process pain through withdrawal rather than expression. It is the same avoidance the therapist identified years earlier. The introduction of Henrik as a layer beneath the betrayal is crucial. It transforms this from a private marital wound into something more systemic, a breach in the professional world Marcus has also organized his sense of self around. He defines himself through his job as much as his marriage. The possibility that both could be compromised simultaneously sets up a psychological double threat that will compound as the story progresses. His stability, it seems, was built on ground that multiple people had already begun to quietly excavate. The morning after is always the hardest part of any secret, not for the person keeping it, but for the person who has just begun to suspect. I made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice for Lena. Claire came downstairs in her work clothes, a slate blue blouse I'd seen before, hair still slightly damp at the ends. She poured herself coffee, kissed Lena on the top of her head, glanced at her phone twice in 4 minutes. Nothing in her face suggested anything was wrong. That was what unsettled me most, not guilt, not performance. Just normalcy, delivered so fluently it could only be the result of long practice. I watched her hands. This is something I'd started doing without consciously deciding to, watching her hands, the way you watch a card dealer when you suspect something's off but can't name it yet. Claire had expressive hands, she'd spent years using them to explain design concepts, to sketch in the air, to gesture through arguments. But that morning they were still. Deliberately, carefully still. She held her coffee cup in both palms and looked out the kitchen window at the gray February street, and I thought, she's somewhere else entirely. Big day? I asked. Presentation for the Faro account, she said. Daniel wants to see the final mock-ups. First name. No hesitation. She said it the way you say the name of someone you're used to saying, not the way you'd say a client's name to your husband over breakfast. I noted it. Filed it. Said nothing. Lena was talking about something that happened at school, something involving a disagreement over crayons that had apparently escalated significantly, and I nodded and responded and cut her toast into triangles the way she liked it, all while running a quiet, separate conversation in my own head that had nothing to do with crayons. The first sign I can now pinpoint with clarity was the phone, not that night with the message, but 2 months earlier, in December. Claire had always been someone who left her phone around carelessly. On the coffee table, face up. In the pocket of a jacket on the back of a chair. Charging on the kitchen counter overnight. It was one of those small habits that signals comfort, the comfort of having nothing to hide. In December, that changed. Slowly at first. The phone migrated to her pocket. Then the pocket of whatever she was wearing at the time, even at home, even in the evening. Then it started sleeping on her nightstand instead of the shared charging dock on the dresser. I noticed. I told myself it was nothing. The second sign was the gym. Claire had been a casual, reluctant exerciser for most of our marriage, the kind of person who would buy a gym membership in January with excellent intentions and quietly abandon it by March. In October, she joined a new place near her office. By December, she was going 3, sometimes 4 times a week. Her body didn't change significantly, which I mention not as criticism but as observation, because when someone exercises obsessively for 3 months and their physique stays roughly the same, there are a limited number of explanations for what they're actually doing during that time. I didn't let myself form the thought completely. That's the strange thing about suspicion in its early stages. You can hold a thought right up to its logical conclusion and then simply not finish it, the way you stop reading a word halfway through and move on. The mind protects itself. Or it tries to. Work was its own strange texture during this period. I'd been managing a significant project, the structural review of a commercial renovation in MIT, that kept me late 2 or 3 evenings a week. Henrik was involved at a senior level, which meant our contact was more frequent than usual, morning briefings, shared spreadsheets, the occasional lunch. He was, as always, professionally warm. Henrik was the kind of man who made you feel seen in a meeting. He'd ask after Lena by name, remember details from conversations weeks old, create the impression of genuine personal investment. I'd always found this quality admirable. Now I wonder if I mistook performance for sincerity. There was one afternoon in February, about 6 weeks after the December phone shift, when I was leaving Henrik's office after a briefing and he stopped me at the door. "How's Claire?" he asked. Standard enough. He'd met her at company events. But there was something in the way he said it, a slight pause before her name, a fraction of a second that shouldn't have been there. I looked at him. He was already reaching for his reading glasses, already moving on, already not looking at me. "She's well," I said. "Busy with a new account." "Good," he said, and put his glasses on. I walked to my car thinking about that pause for 10 minutes and then made myself stop. Meanwhile, Lena had started having nightmares. This began in January, about 3 weeks after whatever had shifted in our household began to make itself felt in the atmosphere, that invisible barometric drop that children sense before adults will admit it exists. She'd wake in the night calling for me specifically, not Claire, which was unusual. Claire had always been the one Lena ran to. I was the breakfast maker, the school-run provider, the steady background presence. But now Lena wanted me at 2 a.m., pressing her face into my shoulder, not crying exactly, just holding on. "What do you dream about?" I asked her once. "The house getting smaller," she said, and went back to sleep. I lay in the dark next to her for a long time after that. Claire and I were still sleeping in the same bed. Still having dinners together. Still having what passed for conversation, logistics, Lena, the news, weekend plans. The shape of our marriage remained intact. Only the substance had begun to hollow out, quietly, the way rot works in wood, invisible at the surface for a long time, until the day you put your hand on it and it gives. This section operates on the psychology of motivated perception, the mind's capacity to register alarming data while simultaneously refusing to process its implications. Marcus notices every significant sign, the phone migration, the gym pattern, the pause in Henrik's voice, Lena's nightmares. He is, professionally, a man trained to assess structural integrity. He reads weight distributions and stress points for a living. And yet when the structure closest to him begins to show fault lines, he employs the exact opposite of his professional instinct, he looks away. This is not stupidity. It is self-preservation. Confronting the truth of a 12-year marriage requires dismantling the identity built within it. Marcus's sense of self, steady, dependable, present, is only coherent within the framework of a functioning marriage. To name the suspicion is to begin its destruction, and so the mind negotiates, it files, notes, observes, and defers conclusion indefinitely. Claire's behavior in this section reveals the psychology of a person who has already emotionally exited the marriage but has not yet decided what to do with that exit. She is not cruel, she is absent. The naturalness with which she says Daniel's name at breakfast is more revealing than any nervous slip would be. She has stopped performing concealment because, internally, she has already separated Marcus from the part of her life where Daniel exists. They inhabit different psychological rooms in her mind, and she moves between them with practiced ease. Lena's nightmares function as the story's emotional seismograph, registering underground tremors that the adults are refusing to acknowledge. Children often absorb marital anxiety somatically, expressing in sleep what cannot be spoken in waking life. Her dream of the house getting smaller is almost unbearably precise. She cannot name what is shrinking, but she feels its dimensions closing. March arrived with a week of unexpected warmth that made the city feel briefly, deceptively hopeful. It was also the month Claire bought the perfume. She came home one Thursday with a small bag from a fragrance boutique in Mitt, the kind of shop neither of us had ever gone into, the kind with a single lit candle in the window and prices that aren't displayed. She pulled out a slim black bottle and set it on the bathroom shelf without particular ceremony, the way you'd set down groceries. "Treat yourself?" I asked. "Colleague's recommendation," she said. She was already spraying it, once at the throat, once at the wrist, and the scent reached me a moment later, something dark and woody, expensive and serious. Not her usual register at all. Claire had always worn light, clean scents. This was something you'd wear for someone specific. "Nice," I said, "because what else do you say?" That Saturday she said she was meeting her friend Petra for lunch. Petra was a real person. I'd met her several times, a cheerful landscape architect who lived in Prenzlauer Berg and had once spent an entire dinner party explaining the emotional significance of birch trees. Claire had known her since university. The alibi was credible. I told myself it was credible. But when Claire left that afternoon, I noticed she was wearing the new perfume. For lunch with Petra. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while after she left. Lena was at her grandmother's for the weekend. My mother, who lived 40 minutes south and who had recently taken to calling me at odd hours to ask if everything was all right at home. I'd told her yes. Everything was all right at home. She'd made a small sound that meant she didn't believe me. I picked up my own phone and opened the location-sharing app Claire and I had set up 3 years ago, initially for Lena's safety, then kept on between us as one of those practical measures couples adopt without examining too closely. It was still active. I'd never used it on Claire before. The thought had never occurred to me, because the thought had never needed to. Her location showed a restaurant in Charlottenburg. I knew the area. I did not know that restaurant. It was not near anywhere Petra lived or worked. I put the phone down. I picked it up again. I checked the restaurant, a quick search, the kind that takes 40 seconds and changes things. It was small, Italian, candlelit in its photos. The kind of place you take someone you want to impress. Not the kind of place Petra and Claire would choose. They were coffee Anahuac people, always had been. I could have called Claire. I didn't. I called Petra instead. I constructed a reason, something about a birthday. Did she remember which restaurant Claire had mentioned last time they tried a new place? And Petra, completely unsuspecting, said, "Oh, we haven't actually managed to get together yet this month." I kept having to push it back. "Why, is something on?" I told her no, never mind, I'd got confused. After I hung up, I sat very still for approximately 3 minutes. Then I drove to Charlottenburg. I didn't know what I was doing, exactly. I told myself I was just driving, taking a route that happened to pass through that neighborhood. It was a lie I told myself with moderate conviction. I parked 2 streets away from the restaurant and walked, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling the particular absurdity of following your own wife on a Saturday afternoon in your own city. The restaurant had a wide front window. I saw her before she saw me. She was at a corner table, half turned toward the window, and she was laughing, really laughing, the way she used to laugh at the gallery opening where we'd met, head slightly back, hand coming up to cover her mouth. Across from her was a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, well-dressed in a dark jacket, the kind of face that reads as confident without being aggressive. He was watching her laugh with the expression of someone who had arranged it deliberately, and was satisfied with the result. I stood on the pavement outside a closed bookshop and watched my wife laugh with another man for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. I drove home through a city that looked completely normal and felt absolutely alien. That evening, Claire came home at 6, slightly flushed, said lunch had been lovely. Petra sent her love. She made pasta for dinner and asked me how my day had been, and I said fine, quiet, nothing much. We watched something on television afterward. I can't remember what. She fell asleep on the couch and I turned the volume down and sat beside her in the dark and thought about the way she'd laughed. I kept thinking, that laugh used to belong to me. But here is where I made the mistake I would later have to reckon with, because I assumed, based on everything I'd seen so far, that this was a straightforward story. Man discovers wife's infidelity. Man confronts situation. Outcome follows. I hadn't yet learned that Henrik was involved. And I hadn't yet noticed that Claire had begun receiving calls from a number I didn't recognize, not Daniel's, not any name in her phone, a number that appeared 3 times in the call log I would eventually, reluctantly, look at. A number that, when I finally traced it, would lead me somewhere entirely unexpected. The question I should have been asking all along wasn't who is she seeing. It was who else knows. This section marks the transition from passive suspicion to active investigation, a shift with significant psychological consequences. By driving to Charlottenburg, Marcus crosses a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. The act of surveillance, even when motivated by legitimate pain, changes the surveiller. It introduces a layer of secrecy into Marcus's own behavior, making him, in a limited sense, a participant in the deception that is being practiced against him. This is one of betrayal's cruelest mechanics. It forces the wronged party to adopt the tactics of the wrongdoer in order to uncover the truth. The scene at the restaurant window is constructed around loss rather than anger. Marcus does not feel rage when he sees Claire laughing. He feels grief, specifically, the grief of recognizing something that was once his and no longer is. The laugh she shares with Daniel is not a new laugh, it is the same one from the gallery opening, the one that made strangers turn around. The betrayal, at this moment, feels not like theft but like displacement. The Petra alibi is worth examining closely. Claire's use of a real, known friendship as cover is sophisticated. It provides texture and credibility while remaining untraceable unless Marcus takes the improbable step of calling Petra directly. That he does call, and quickly, indicates that suspicion has reached a stage where self-deception is no longer sustainable. Something in him has decided to know, even while another part delays the confrontation. The closing question, not who she's seeing, but who else knows, signals a critical evolution in Marcus's understanding. He is beginning to see the betrayal as systemic rather than isolated, which psychologically represents both maturity and danger. Systems are harder to dismantle than individuals. April. The light changed. The evening stretched out, and somehow that felt like cruelty, all that extra daylight in which to think. I began to keep notes. Not a journal, nothing so deliberate. Just a notes app on my phone, dated entries in shorthand that only I could read. Times, observations, discrepancies. The gap between what Claire said she was doing and what the location app quietly, irrefutably showed. I was methodical about it, in the way I was methodical about load calculations, no assumptions, only documented facts. What those facts showed, accumulated over 3 weeks, was this: Claire had told me she was at the office late on 7 separate evenings when her location showed her in Charlottenburg, MIT, or once, disturbingly, Potsdam. She'd attended 2 client dinners that she mentioned only afterward, as afterthoughts. She'd come home on 4 occasions smelling of a restaurant, that particular mixture of wine and warm food that clings to hair and fabric, when she'd said she'd eaten at her desk. The unknown phone number appeared twice more in April. I traced it on a Saturday morning while Claire took Lena to her swimming lesson, a weekly ritual that gave me approximately 90 minutes of uninterrupted time. It took some effort. The number wasn't attached to any business I could find, wasn't a standard mobile prefix. It was eventually traceable, through a roundabout sequence of cross-referencing I'm not proud of, to a prepaid SIM registered to a name, Miriam Farrow. I sat with that name for a long time. Miriam Farrow. As in, Pharaoh. As in Daniel Pharaoh's wife. The scenario began to rearrange itself in my head. I'd been operating with a simple model. Claire was conducting an affair with a client named Daniel. But if Daniel's wife was calling Claire, not texting, calling, 3 times in recent weeks, then either Miriam Pharaoh had discovered the affair and was reaching out to the other woman, or something else was happening entirely. Something more complicated, involving all of them. I needed to know which. I also needed, finally, to understand what Henrik knew. Because the more I thought about that pause, that fraction of a second hesitation before her name, the less I believed it was nothing. Henrik Kellner was not a man who paused unintentionally. He was precise, in speech as in everything. And his son Daniel was his professional protege. The creative director position had been engineered, everyone at the firm knew, partly through Henrik's industry connections. If Daniel was involved with my wife, and if that involvement had been going on for months, the question of whether Henrik knew had only one probable answer. I chose a Wednesday, Henrik's most relaxed day, no standing meetings after lunch, and engineered a reason to stay late. The office emptied gradually after 6. I waited until I could hear only the building's ambient sounds, and then I went to Henrik's office and tried the door. It was unlocked. I'm not a man who goes through other people's things. I want to be clear about that, not as self-justification but as context. This was not who I was, and the fact that I did it anyway tells you something about where I'd arrived psychologically. I stood in Henrik's office in the pale evening light and I looked through the things on his desk the way you look for a structural fault, systematically, without touching more than necessary. What I found was unremarkable on the surface: the usual papers, project files, a printed email chain about a property development in Leipzig. But in the bottom drawer, under a folder, I found something that didn't belong to a work context: a printed photograph, recent by the look of it, of Daniel and Claire at what appeared to be a restaurant. The angle suggested it had been taken with a long lens, candid, not posed. Someone had been having them photographed. Underneath the photo was a handwritten note. 4 words: handle this. Before April. The handwriting wasn't Henrik's. I photographed everything on my phone, replaced it exactly as I found it, and left the building. I sat in my car for 10 minutes with the engine off before I could make myself drive. Someone, not Henrik, had been watching Daniel and Claire. Someone had handed Henrik a photograph and a deadline. That someone had a relationship to Henrik significant enough to issue what amounted to an instruction rather than a request. The following Monday, I arrived at work early and searched Daniel Pharaoh's professional history more carefully than I had before. What I found, gradually, across an afternoon of careful looking, was this: Daniel Pharaoh had a pattern. Not with every client, but a pattern existed: 2 previous professional relationships that had ended abruptly, each involving a complaint that had been quietly settled, each involving a woman colleague or client. Henrik had managed both situations. The settlements had cost money. The pattern had cost nothing, apparently, because Daniel still had his position. Henrik had been protecting his son. And now someone was pressuring Henrik to stop. That someone, I was beginning to believe, was Miriam Pharaoh, Daniel's wife. A woman who had apparently spent years managing the consequences of her husband's choices, who had gathered enough documentation to make a senior partner nervous, and who had been calling my wife's number 3 times in recent weeks. The question was no longer just what did Claire do. It was what did Miriam want from her. And deeper still, beneath all of it, a question I didn't want to ask: was Claire a victim of Daniel's pattern, or a willing participant, or some complicated, painful version of both? The gathering of proof phase is, psychologically, a stage of profound moral complexity. Marcus makes several choices in this section that he himself would not have predicted. He accesses location data without consent, enters his employer's private office, photographs confidential documents. Each of these acts represents a small erosion of the ethical framework he has defined himself by, driven by the necessity of knowing what is actually real. Consider the alternative scenario: Marcus confronts Claire directly after seeing her in the restaurant. A direct confrontation at that stage would have been emotionally immediate but informationally incomplete. He would have known about the affair but nothing about Daniel's pattern, Miriam's involvement, or Henrik's complicity. The confrontation would have been framed as a straightforward betrayal story: husband, wife, other man, with the attendant emotional scripts: guilt, apology, negotiation or separation. By choosing investigation over confrontation, Marcus does something uncomfortable but ultimately more clarifying. He discovers that Claire exists within a larger system of deception, one that implicates her, Daniel, Henrik, and Miriam in overlapping ways. The affair is real, but it may also be, in part, something that happened to Claire as much as something she chose. Daniel's documented pattern with women suggests a man skilled at creating emotional investment under controlled conditions, using professional dynamics as cover and leverage. This does not absolve Claire of responsibility for her choices. It complicates them, which is precisely what reality tends to do to situations we initially understand as simple. The moral ambiguity Marcus is forced into, the gray of conducting surveillance on people he trusted, mirrors the gray he is beginning to find in Claire's situation itself. Both of them are, in different ways, acting outside who they believed themselves to be. It was the second Saturday in May when everything collapsed at once. Lena was at a birthday party, one of her school friends, a 3-hour window of structural cover. Claire was home. She'd been home all morning, working on her laptop at the dining table with the focused, slightly remote quality she'd had for weeks now, a woman present in body and elsewhere in everything else. I'd spent the previous 48 hours constructing what I was going to say. I'd made notes. I'd rehearsed it. None of it survived contact with the actual moment. I sat down across from her at the table. "I need to talk to you," I said. She looked up. Something in my face must have been different, because something in hers changed immediately, not guilt, exactly, but a kind of preparation. A settling. Like a person who has been expecting a particular door to open and now hears the handle turn. "Okay," she said. She closed her laptop. "I know about Daniel," I said. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds I watched her face move through several things: the beginning of denial, the assessment of what I might know, and then, and this was the part that hit hardest, a kind of relief. Not happiness. Relief. As if she'd been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. "How long?" she said. "I've known something was wrong since December. I've known it was him since March." She nodded slowly. She looked at her hands on the table. "I don't know where to start," she said. "Start with whether you're in love with him," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. She looked up at me. "I thought I was," she said. "I don't think I know what I was. I think I was," she stopped. "I think I got lost. I think I was lonely, and he was very," she stopped again. "Deliberate," I said. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression. "What do you know?" "I know he's done this before. I know Henrik has been managing it. I know Miriam has been calling you." The color left her face. "Miriam called you 3 times in April," I said. I traced the number. "She was photographing you and Daniel, someone was, and she had the photos sent to Henrik with a note telling him to deal with it." "What does she want, Claire?" Claire sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "She wants me to testify." I hadn't expected that. "She's filing for divorce," Claire said. "She has a lawyer. She needs women who can corroborate the pattern, who can confirm that Daniel's involvement was calculated, that he initiates with professional contacts deliberately, that there's a method to it. She approached me because she knew about us and because she thought I'd cooperate." She paused. She wasn't wrong. Something rearranged itself in my understanding. "So you've been in contact with Miriam?" "Since February." "You've been," I stopped. "Reassembled." "When did it end with Daniel?" "February," she said. "After Miriam first called me." She met my eyes. "I know that's not," I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't change what I did. It didn't. She was right about that. But it changed the shape of what I was dealing with. Claire's affair had been over for 3 months. She had spent those 3 months living in our house, in our marriage, participating in Miriam Farrow's divorce case preparation, while I sat across from her at dinner and talked about the news. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because telling you meant telling you everything," she said. "And I didn't know how to do that and still have." She looked around the room, briefly, as if measuring it. I didn't know what there would be left. We sat in the kitchen for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the table between us. At one point Claire started crying, quietly, not the performative crying of someone seeking sympathy, but the exhausted kind, the kind that happens when you've been keeping yourself together through an act of sustained will and you finally stop. I didn't touch her. I wasn't ready for that. But I told her what I'd found in Henrik's office. The photograph. The note. The pattern I'd uncovered. And then, because I'd been holding it back, I said, "Henrik knew. About Daniel and you specifically. Someone told him, or he found out, and he didn't say a word to me. 6 years, Claire. He had lunch with me in March and asked how you were." The look on her face told me she hadn't known that. "He's been protecting Daniel," I said. "Using me, in the process. Keeping me close enough to manage while his son." I couldn't finish that sentence. "I'm going to HR on Monday," I said instead. "And I'm calling Miriam Farrow's lawyer." Claire looked at me. "To help her case?" "To add Henrik's conduct to it," I said. "Concealing a pattern of workplace-adjacent predatory behavior to protect a family member is not a footnote. It's material." She nodded very slowly. "Okay," she said. And then Lena came home, 2 hours early, the party cut short by some logistical disaster involving a broken piñata and a burst pipe, arriving with frosting on her dress and completely unaware that she'd walked into the wreckage of a conversation that had altered everything, and we both straightened, we both composed ourselves, and I went to help her wash her hands because some things you just keep doing. That night, after Lena was asleep, Claire came downstairs and found me in the kitchen. "I don't know if we can come back from this," she said. "Neither do I," I said. It was the most honest thing either of us had said to each other in months, and we both knew it. The confrontation scene is governed by a central emotional paradox. Marcus has prepared for devastation and instead encounters something more difficult to navigate: complexity. Claire's betrayal is real, her pain is real, her cooperation with Miriam is also real. Marcus's anger, which he has been organizing and storing for weeks, has nowhere clean to land. His steadiness during the confrontation is psychologically significant. He does not shout, does not issue ultimatums, does not collapse. He listens, responds, and strategizes, moving almost immediately from the personal wound to the systemic wrong represented by Henrik's conduct. This pivot is not avoidance, it is a man channeling emotion into action because action feels more manageable than grief. The announcement that he'll go to HR on Monday is, emotionally, a way of doing something with feelings that have no other outlet. Claire's relief is the confrontation's most important and least comfortable detail. Secrets are exhausting to maintain, their discovery, even catastrophically, brings a form of rest. Her admission that she thought she was in love with Daniel, followed by the retreat into uncertainty, "I don't know what I was," is not dishonesty but the genuine confusion of a person who acted on feelings she may not have fully understood. The image of Lena arriving home with frosting on her dress and stepping unknowingly into the wreckage is the scene's emotional center. Domestic life, washing hands, keeping routines, continues in parallel with collapse. This is the truth of family crisis, it does not suspend ordinary life. Ordinary life continues around it, making demands, requiring participation, reminding you that some things you just keep doing regardless of what has broken. Marcus's final exchange with Claire, "I don't know if we can come back from this, / neither do I, is the first moment of genuine marital honesty the story has shown. Paradoxically, the affair that created distance has, at the moment of confrontation, briefly collapsed it. The weeks after a confrontation like that one moves strangely. Time doesn't speed up or slow down exactly, it becomes uneven, with long flat stretches of ordinary life interrupted by sudden vertical drops into grief or anger or something you can't name at all. I filed a formal complaint with HR on Monday. I put everything in writing, what I'd found in Henrik's office, the photograph, the note, the pattern I'd documented. I did not do this impulsively. I spent the weekend writing it carefully, fact by fact, with no editorializing. I was, in the end, a structural engineer. I knew how to document load and stress. Henrik was placed on administrative leave within the week. The investigation that followed, which involved HR, an external legal firm, and eventually the other two women from Daniel's history, took 8 weeks. I was interviewed twice. I told them what I knew. I did not exaggerate, did not embellish. I didn't need to. Daniel Farrow's contract with Claire's agency was terminated in June. His divorce proceedings with Miriam were underway by then, and the case was not straightforward. Miriam's lawyer was methodical and very good. I'd spoken to her once, briefly, at Miriam's request, a 10-minute call in which I confirmed what I'd found and offered to provide a written statement if needed. She thanked me with the precise, contained gratitude of a woman who has been managing a crisis for a long time and is not yet able to exhale. Claire and I began couples therapy in May. Different therapist than before, a woman named Dr. Hartmann who worked from a quiet office in Charlottenburg and said very little but listened in a way that made you feel genuinely heard. The first few sessions were nearly unbearable, not because of what was said but because of what couldn't be said yet. We were two people who had lost fluency in each other and were sitting in the same room trying to learn it again. I won't tell you we fixed everything. I won't offer you that ending because it wouldn't be true. What I can tell you is this: we are still married. We are still in that apartment with the kitchen where I sat with cold coffee and watched her phone go dark. Lena still sleeps upstairs with her stuffed elephant, and she has not had a nightmare in 2 months, which I count as significant. The sessions with Dr. Hartmann have become, over time, something I look forward to, not because they are comfortable but because they are honest, and there is a version of comfort in that. I had lunch with a colleague recently, not from Kellner and Braun, a contact from a separate project, and he asked how things were. I said fine, getting there. He nodded in the way that people nod when they sense there is more and are not going to push. What I didn't say, and have been thinking about since. I spent 12 years in a marriage I thought I understood, with a woman I thought I knew, inside a professional life I thought was straightforward, and I was wrong about all 3 in ways that turned out to be related. Claire had drifted into something she couldn't name: loneliness, restlessness, vulnerability to someone skilled at providing temporary answers to real needs. Henrik had spent years building a professional persona of warmth and investment that turned out to serve his family first and his employees distantly. Daniel had learned to use context and access as tools, with enough practice charm to make each situation feel singular to the person inside it. None of these people were simply villains. That's the part that takes the longest to metabolize. I had my own failures, the emotional avoidance the therapist had named years ago, the retreat into function when presence was needed, the habit of coming home and being adequate when Claire needed something less measured and more alive. I'm not distributing blame. I'm trying to be accurate. What I've come to understand, in the way you understand something not through a single revelation but through repeated small realizations, trust is not a static state. It's a practice. It has to be renewed, not through grand gestures but through the accumulation of small, genuine choices. The presence of the body without the presence of the mind is not the same as being there. Adequacy is not intimacy. And the moments when a relationship most needs attention are often exactly the moments when both people, exhausted by ordinary life, choose instead to look away. Lena came home last week with a drawing she'd made at school. It was our house, bright yellow, cartoonishly large windows, the 3 of us in the garden. Stick figures with enormous hands. She'd written our names underneath in her careful, slightly crooked letters. She handed it to me with the focused pride of someone presenting serious work. "It's us," she said, unnecessarily. I can see that, I said. It's very good. She took it back, looked at it critically, nodded once in satisfaction, and went upstairs. I stood in the hallway holding that image in my mind, that bright yellow house, those enormous hands, and thought about how children draw what they need to believe in. Then I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on, because some things you keep doing, and the keeping of them is not nothing. The keeping of them is, sometimes, everything. The resolution the story arrives at is neither triumph nor surrender, it is the honest middle ground of consequence managed over time. Marcus does not divorce Claire, but he does not forgive her in the simple, declarative sense of that word. He begins a process, and the story is careful to present that process as ongoing rather than completed. This is psychologically realistic. Betrayal of this scale, compounded by the institutional betrayal of Henrik's conduct, is not resolved through a single confrontation or decision. It accumulates, and so does its healing. The accumulation effect is central to understanding how this crisis was possible in the first place. What emerged over 12 years was not a sudden failure but the slow buildup of unaddressed needs, unchecked patterns, and unmaintained connections. Claire's loneliness was not manufactured by Daniel, it existed before him. Daniel located it the way a fault line is located by stress. He didn't create the weakness, he exploited what was already there. Henrik's protectiveness of Daniel had been operational for years before it impacted Marcus directly. Marcus's emotional avoidance had been named in therapy years earlier and not fully resolved. The drawing Lena brings home is the story's final and most precise image, a child rendering the family she needs to believe is intact, with enormous hands that suggest holding on. Children do not draw what they see, they draw what they need. That Lena still draws the three of them together is not naivety, it is its own kind of pressure, the love that makes its claim without language. The closing reflection, the keeping of them is, sometimes, everything, is the story's thesis, quietly stated. Continuity matters. Showing up for the small domestic acts of a shared life, even when that life is fractured, is not weakness or avoidance. It is the practice of choosing to remain. That choice, made daily rather than once, is where recovery actually lives. At its deepest level, this is a story about the gap between the life we perform and the life we actually inhabit, and what happens when that gap becomes too wide to sustain. Marcus built a marriage on the currency of reliability. Claire built hers on the expectation of connection. These are not incompatible, but they are different languages, and the failure to translate between them, over 12 years, incrementally, in the space of small unanswered needs and unasked questions, created the conditions for every event that followed. Daniel Farrow did not destroy a marriage. He found one that had quietly been losing its structural integrity for years and applied pressure at a point that was already stressed. The institutional layer, Henrik's complicity, Daniel's pattern, Miriam's long and largely invisible suffering, positions the personal betrayal within a larger system of convenience, men who use access and authority to create situations that serve them, institutions that manage the consequences to preserve the existing order. Marcus's decision to go to HR is, in this reading, not merely a professional act but an ethical one, the refusal to absorb a wrong privately while those responsible continue undisturbed. What makes this story resonant beyond its specific circumstances is the universality of its central failure, the failure of attention. Marcus was present but not attentive. Claire was connected but not honest. Henrik was warm but not trustworthy. All of them had learned to simulate the outward forms of their relationships while something essential had quietly gone unmaintained. The research on long-term relationships consistently identifies not dramatic betrayals but chronic inattention as the primary driver of marital collapse. Conflict is not the enemy of intimacy, avoidance is. The couples who survive crisis are not those who never face it, but those who have built enough genuine transparency to face it together rather than alone. Marcus and Claire are, at the story's end, attempting to build exactly that. It is late. It is hard. It is the only thing, now, that is actually worth doing. The house is still standing. The kettle goes on. And the choice to remain, imperfect, uncertain, honest, is made again.